Perfect, thank you so much. So again, just for the purpose of recording, my name is Nasseri, Policy Officer at Clinks, and welcome to today's seminar, which is focusing on campaigning in the face of hostility. This session is brought to you as part of the Stronger Voice project. It's a 3-year project funded by the Lloyds Bank Foundation for England and Wales and delivered by us at Clinks. Just a brief background about the project. The project aims to support voluntary organisations working in the criminal justice system to develop a unified and influential voice at both a national and regional level. We want people in the sector to feel really confident about how you can use your expertise to speak out on the issues that matter to you and the people that you support. The project runs until March 2023, and the first phase of the project, centred around finding your voice, is already underway. There are further 2 phases of the projects ahead, so we will continue to keep adding more sessions, including more expert seminars like this. So please do check out our website and our email bulletins for more information on that. So that's a little bit about the Stronger Voice project. A little bit more about today's event. We know that voluntary organisations play a vital role in raising awareness of the damaging government policy and proposing solutions to address systemic issues in the criminal justice system. The sector frequently achieves positive change on behalf of and alongside people that face marginalisation and discrimination. Many organisations will, however, feel that this work is currently being conducted in a particularly challenging context. Both the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill and the Nationality and Borders Bill are progressing through Parliament despite sustained voluntary sector opposition, leaving many organisations wondering how they can achieve meaningful change in the current climate. In this expert seminar, we're going to hear from Ghadah Alnasseri, Head of Policy and Public Affairs at Hibiscus Initiatives, and Greg Sproston, Policy Manager at the Traveller Movement. They're going to reflect on their experiences of advocating for marginalised people, campaigning against damaging policies, and maintaining a sense of energy and optimism in the face of social and political hostility. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Ghadah, and she's going to share her screen and take you away.
Thank you so much, Nuri. Hi, everyone. My name is Ghadah Alnasseri, and I am the Head of Policy and Public Affairs at Hibiscus. I'm very glad to join you today. Just to tell you more about Hibiscus, so we are a leading organization. We work with marginalized women, Black, ethnic, minority, and migrant women, and we help them into the immigration and criminal justice system and to rebuild their life. Some numbers of our work from last year: we supported 840 people from 100 countries. We work in 3 prisons, 5 detention centers, and we have 1 women's center in London, which we provide practical support, well-being, agency, and empowerment and development. I just want to leave this with you for a bit. This is what we've been what the women that we work with told us, and it's like you don't just become survivor of human trafficking and slavery, you're always surviving. You must keep on surviving. And this is another quote from another woman that came here seeking for protection and safety, that it's a very difficult journey seeking refuge. Every day I cry. I have felt this way in the past. It was when I was abused. I came to search freedom. I can't stay in detention. I need to be free. So these are direct messages from the women that we work with, one in the detention, the other one we work with them in the community, which are the majority of the women that we work with are victims of modern slavery and human trafficking. As probably, some of kind of wanted to talk more about the Nationality and Borders Bill. In general, I had to update my presentation this morning just because it's quite good news. This is kind of more of this, how we keep optimism and keep working is when you see this news. But still, the bill is very harmful. It's been rejected by the peers because on these 2 clauses, the clause of 11, which is the criminalized refugees, that the method of their arriving in the UK, and the clause 9, which is to kind of strip the British citizens without notice. But then still, the clause that we work on, which we are campaigning, and which is clause 51, which is threatened to criminalize people who are looking to find protection and impose jail sentences on them. And this is one of the you know, it will be directly, if this bill will be kind of passed, it will be directly impacted the women that we work with, and they will be falling out of the, you know, support system and the protection. And how this bill will impact the victims of modern slavery. The bill definitely, as I said, like penalize victims of modern slavery because of they will have extra barriers on identification, safeguarding, and support and access to criminal justice. They will be disqualified for protection, so they will not be able to be recognized under the national referral system. The women that we work with, definitely the client that we work with, they need more time to actually tell their abused. Majority of them, they don't even know they are trafficked. They think they are coming on these journeys for work, or they are within this kind of relationship with the man, and they think that this is kind of a boyfriend or a partner that they're going to bring them here, like to the UK, and work and be with. So it will take them a long time to realize they've been trafficked. They don't even know what trafficking means. So we work with them into, first of all, let them have the time and space. But if the bill will be imposed, they will not have the right to apply for asylum and protection. And thousands of the victims of modern slavery will be out of support, and they will be as well as criminalized and be in prison. So this is how harmful it is. This is why we work with, because we have direct frontline work with the victims of modern slavery, and the bill will be very harmful for all of the work we do. Some kind of more of the work that we do on anti-trafficking. For example, for last year, we supported 200 potential victims of trafficking in prison, detention, and community. 85% of the women that we work with are survivors of trafficking. We support them into the NRM system with the direct support, and as well as we work with a different organization to develop partnerships and like sign joint statements to kind of more strengthen the call for support, providing support and identifying the needs of the victims of trafficking. So as well as that, the work we did recently, we work with the 5 different organizations, and we produce a 10-point action plan, which are very specifically addressing the needs and kind of more highlighting the kind of injustices that Black, Asian, minorities, and migrant women in the criminal justice system. More work we do is like, I can see, I think, Emily from Bell Foundation, which is one of our funders, which we work on the cultural mediation. So one of the work that we do is we actually provide cultural mediation to clients as well as in their own languages. This is a kind of a model that I've been using with Hibiscus and has proven to be effective. So the client will be well supported and well kind of more have the ability to be integrated in the community, as well as get the support that they needed. So we have a report on the cultural mediation, which is definitely reduce the cultural and the language barriers for the survivor of trafficking, and it's available on our website. From this report, we actually developed training, and the training we train as part of Clinks. We provide us with a platform. We trained over 16 organizations into the need for the intersectional need for migrant women, as well as for the cultural mediation for different women rights organizations and frontline support service providers. As well as we have the closed door report, and this is one of the report that we highlighting the lack of housing for victims of trafficking, and how the potential female victims of trafficking are able to get safe housing. So this is some of the work that we do. We produce reports. The tackling disadvantage, the 10 action plans. These are some of the quotes from the women that we work with, and they were being in like a part of the project. So we did a consultation with the women, as well as to kind of input their valid lived experience into developing the action plan and addressing what are the issues are in the criminal justice system that they are facing. And these are some of the quotes that they told us, which is one of them I would read to you is, when you're Black, it's like being a prison in the prison system, a poison in the prison system. I didn't get the chance to tell my story. I pleaded guilty to something I didn't do. I don't know whether it's the color of my skin or that I'm Muslim and I was treated differently. So, so this is one of the organizations that we worked with, is Muslim women in prison, and they support Muslim women, and we support like more Black ethnic minority women. And we work as well with Zaid Mubarak Foundation, Zaid Mubarak organization, which they work with the Roma and traveler community. So we try to do so how did we actually did the action plan and the tackling disadvantage, the double disadvantage. So we did this kind of a way of doing it, and it's kind of for me to share with all the organization the stages that we actually have produced this action plan. And so we did a stakeholder engagement event. We invite everyone to identify key challenges. We analyze literature, current literature, which is a previous report. We didn't want to rewrite report again. They're there. It's all been addressing all the inequality, injustices in the criminal justice system. And then we conducted a thematic seminars with the women with lived experiences from the three group of women that from the three different organizations. And we worked with them into incorporating their stories and their experiences into the 10-point action plan for change. And then after that, after we produced the action plan, we actually held a roundtable with senior government officials. With the Ministry of Justice, with MOPAC, as well as with some of the MPs. And we invited them to a close kind of session, and we worked on the action plan, and they gave us feedback and which of the actions points they were interested in working with us on that. And I think this is one of the kind of experiences and the work we do, because we have kind of joined forces with the 5 organizations, and we have a different expertise and different kind of work we do. Some of us, we work on policy. Some of us, we provide different like direct support to the women. And we represented the kind of different groups of the kind of the client of the people with lived experience. And that's, I think, why it gave us more like the kind of weight and impact. After that, we've been featured like in different newsletters like The Guardian, the iNews, as well as with The Voice and different newsletter on the action plan when we launched it this year. And the next step what we're doing now, we're having really bilateral kind of meetings with the government, with certain different government official on certain actions. Each organization of the 5 organizations having this close relationship with a government official on working how us as a kind of by and for specialist organization can help the government official into making these changes, as well as bringing the women with lived experience to the table to tell them and to kind of co-work with us on these changes. So we're trying to kind of include, and it could be a very like inclusive with the with the service receivers, which are the women with lived experience. So these are the action. I don't know if you have actually seen it. I can share like the whole action plan in the chat. But then the 10 action point for change. So one of them is to train criminal justice system on cultural mediation, which is we actually this is what the Bell Foundation funding for cultural mediation that we have at the moment. We created the training, and we have a possibility to train the MOJ staff, as well as other sector organizations, developing practical resource and guides for and the right of the Black, Asian, minoritized women when they have a language barrier. So this is the kind of interpretation and language barriers and cultural mediation needs. Recruit them recruit the people with lived experience as peer mentors. And thus as well, we are working closely with the probation services onto that. And how we can prepare, for this training or for this stage of the peer mentors kind of qualification. To ask them to publish on their reports on more annual basis to identify, analyze at greater depth on the racial disparities, because as an organization, we don't know actually the government, they don't produce any data. So we are wanted for them to produce more data to know like how many of these women are like, falling out of the system, why they are not being supported, and how we can address that. And then end of use of this proportionate remand and custodial sentencing on Black, in general, but this is specifically on Black, Asian, minoritized women. Identify some gaps in the probation service with insecure immigration, and this is what comes with the borders bill. This is the connection with the criminal justice system and immigration. When they are falling out of the system, when they are not being recognized as a right for protection, they could be definitely starting their life in, in prison, and then ended in detention and being deported. So how we can support them into not falling into that trap. Improve effective of current external scrutiny bodies to identify challenges and direct and indirect discrimination. As you saw from the quote from the woman, there are direct discriminations, and they not being being informed. They don't know what's their right. They say because of the way I look, because I wear a scarf, because I'm Black, I've been treated differently. So there was very direct message from the women that it's really affected them, and this is how they felt. So we wanted them to work on that, and how we make sure that the migrant women and individual circumstances, and especially effective, they've been supported by effective legal representation and pre-sentence reports. Ensure accessibility to funding for us as an for all of the organizations on funding us to do our work, because it's really difficult to navigate the current systems and apply for funding, as well as identify some issues relating to the farmer review and strengthening family relations, which really impacted the community, and what's the difference between different communities. For example, one of the women, they like, for example, from their culture, if they will be having any kind of in contact with the criminal justice system, they will not be able to go back to their community. They had to move cities, and the system is not happy and ready for them, and they are actually not being supported accordingly. So we wanted to address these cultural issues, family relation issues, into the kind of the probation, and when women leave prison, and how can these be supported. And that's for me. Thank you very much. I will be happy to answer any questions later on.
Thank you so much. That was very insightful, and it was great to learn a bit more about that 10-point action plan, because that's definitely been something on my list to read. So that's been great. I'm now going to hand over to Greg from the Traveller Movement.
Thanks, Nori, and thanks, Ghadah, for that really, really interesting and illuminating contribution. Sorry, I'm just finding my, I suddenly forget how to use computers when I'm put on the spot. Let me just share my screen, sorry. Okay, so I'm going to take a slightly different approach with my contribution, and sort of consider, rather than sort of the specifics that sort of that the traveller movement do at any given point. I'm going to sort of consider the broader sort of concepts, the broader sort of approaches we consider, and why we think they're important. So about us, I'm Greg, obviously. I've been the policy manager here at Traveller Movement since 2021. Before that, I spent a number of years in Parliament working for MPs, and also in a number of sort of support roles for frontbenchers. So that's my sort of background, and certainly informs some of what I'll be talking about today. So the Traveller Movement are an advocacy org advocating for GRT communities in the UK. We estimate that there are upwards of 300,000 GRT people in the UK, much higher than the census estimate, and we advocate for them across a range of areas, which I'll come to just shortly. That's pretty much what I've already said. Oh, my apologies, I've got my slide orders mixed up. I might come back to that. So as a charity, our vision is a world in which members of GRT communities reach their full potential, where they're accepted by society, where they're proud of who they are and have an equal voice. Our mission is to develop a platform and voice for travellers working in solidarity with Gypsy, Roma and traveller communities within the UK and across Europe to achieve equality. And our ambition is to extend our own influence as a charity and remain an effective UK resource, information and lobbying-based charity for groups, individuals and organisations. So our work is across a number of areas. This is not an exhaustive example by any means, but our sort of main focuses are criminal justice, education, discrimination and hate speech, civil liberties, and women and girls. And then we also do some frontline work with regards to casework and advocacy, which is almost entirely sort of centred around criminal justice education and discrimination. I've also sort of included some, again, inexhaustive examples of what the specific streams of work we have going on at the moment with regards to each of these areas. I think what is important to note is that a lot of these could be in any other area. If you look at sort of the PCSC bill, the implications of that could just as easily come under criminal justice as it could civil liberties. Similarly, the female offender strategy could come under civil liberties. In education, exclusions and off-rolling could potentially come under criminal justice, given the sort of the schools to prison pipeline and the strongly predictive power that school exclusions have for predictive engagement with the criminal justice system. Similarly, discrimination, both direct and indirect, covers almost all the work we do. And I do think it's important to sort of highlight the extent to which these issues are all interconnected. In that regard, we are, I suppose, in quite a lucky position as a charity, insofar as that we have this expertise across a number of different areas, and we can sort of share that information internally. For a lot of other organisations, that obviously won't be the case, and there will be a specific focus on a thematic policy area. And I think that really speaks to the importance of sort of collaboration across the charity or the sort of the communities sector. Oh, sorry. Let me just go back to where my slide was in the wrong place. So just about what I'm going to talk about today. The Traveller Movement, which I've already done, sort of a very quick overview to approaches to parliamentary campaigning, the way that we conceptualise how we build our networks and what we build them for. And then I'll just close with a brief sort of reflections on our experiences with the sort of the recent Jimmy Carr spectacle. For those of you who aren't familiar, I imagine most of you will have seen it in the news in some fashion or another, but there has been obviously significant coverage of Jimmy Carr's atrocious remarks with regards to the Roma victims of the genocide in the Second World War. So that's been a very revealing period for us in terms of our approach to media management. So What I would start with saying with parliamentary engagement, I think it is certainly the norm for the vast majority of charities and sort of other campaigning groups to prioritise lobbying of MPs over Lords. I think it makes a lot of sense to do that. I think the Commons is almost universally understood as sort of the centre of UK political gravity. Certainly, the actions of MPs are covered, I would say, with more intensity and sort of attention in the media than that of the Lords is a general rule of thumb. Campaigning or lobbying MPs is often more effective simply on the basis that they have that accountability to their constituents, and that gives us as organisations obviously a clearer leverage with which we can pressure MPs, which simply is absent for the Lords. MPs are comparatively easy to engage with, simply in a logistical sense. You know, a lot of Lords will not have a publicly available email address. The organisational operation of the Lords, the way the party sort of run it is a little bit looser, and many Lords are simply not active. Whereas at least we know that the vast majority of MPs are regularly on the estate and regularly voting in divisions. I would also say an important factor is that the Lords have traditionally been seen as the more timid of the House. And I mean that sort of in regard specifically to parliamentary conventions, that they tend not to interfere if the government is trying to pass legislation that relates to their manifesto commitments. And again, they've often been quite nervous to act or reluctant to act in the face of a very big Commons majority. I would also say I've never called it this before I was sort of preparing this presentation, but what you might call the hung parliament hangover, which is that I think a lot of campaigning strategies are sort of still reflect a political settlement or political landscape that isn't really there anymore. Obviously, I think for some of us, the vast majority of our working careers will have been in at least a body of years in a time when we had a hung parliament from 2017 to 2019 with a confidence and supply arrangement between the Conservatives and the DUP, and then also the 2 years preceding that from 2015 to 2017 was a very small majority. And what that means is obviously the weight of each individual MP when there's no majority is much more powerful, and you can really sort of succeed in campaigning objectives by sort of individually lobbying sort of sole MPs because of the comparative weight of their vote. This is obviously changed. We now have a very big Conservative majority in the Commons, and campaigning sort of strategies necessarily must change to reflect that. But what I think is very interesting as well, as probably most of you will have seen, this session comes at a very timely point in response to some of the votes yesterday. So we had, obviously, as Ghadah has already mentioned, the Nationality and Borders Bill, some incredible wins last night in the Lords, most notably on Clause 9, as has been mentioned. But each of these divisions that took place last night, all 5 of them, there is a previous division there that I haven't edited out, but these were all non-government amendments which were essentially against the government's position, and every single one was won. We've previously seen in the Lords a similarly strong pushback against a number of elements of the police and crime bill, and this is really significant because we're talking about in both instances manifesto commitments, and the Lords were sort of still willing to sort of make their voice heard, and I do think that has important implications for the way as organisations that we should campaign. On the downside, we had a similarly packed night in the Commons last night, in which conversely these are all government amendments, and the votes reflect the fact that they won each one. I think interestingly what we can see here is that for a number of the votes, the majorities are comparatively smaller. There's a number of Conservative MPs abstaining, but certainly what this shows to us at a glance is that there is real prospect for change in the Lords, which shouldn't be ignored. I think for us there was a particularly impactful vote earlier this year on Part 4 of the Police Crime Courts and Sentencing Bill, which seeks to criminalise make trespass a criminal offence, which would have devastating effects for nomadic communities, and that fell by guttingly a single vote. The vote was tied at 171, and the status quo being in the Commons that the Speaker will cast a vote for the status quo, meaning that the amendment to take that part out of the bill failed. But what I would say is that nevertheless, despite the fact that we didn't win the vote, was quite an incredible vote. I think if you'd have said to us when this bill was first published, do you think you're going to win a vote on this in the Lords? I think most organisations across the GRT sector probably would have said no. So I think the interesting contrast there between the Commons and the Lords is pronounced. I think there are changes underfoot into sort of the role that the House of Lords has, the way that it understands its role constitutionally speaking. They seem much more willing to step up, particularly in response to issues around civil liberties. And broadly, I think this points to a renewed importance on directly lobbying and influencing peers. Obviously, MPs are still important, and I think certainly the abstentions last night might point to a slight precariousness of the government's majority. But certainly, my view on this would be, at the moment, it seems like the Lords is where we're going to get the changes that we want to legislation. I've also noted that I think the impacts of external factors on the way that politicians perceive events is really important. It's a complete counterfactual and a complete sort of supposition on my part. But I wonder if the votes on the Nationality and Borders Bill, particularly Clause 9, yesterday would have passed if it hadn't have been for the situation in Ukraine. And I think particularly the enhanced political scrutiny of the government's position around Ukrainian refugees. And I mention that just to say that even when you're campaigning on something and it looks like there's no real wins to be had, it's important to keep that infrastructure, to keep those frameworks, because it's impossible to know what is around the corner and what political events might unfold. And at the risk of sounding like a conspiracist or a doom monger or anything else, I think that's particularly relevant in the sort of the broader political landscape that we find ourselves in, vis-a-vis cost of living crisis, vis-a-vis fuel costs, vis-a-vis energy costs. We potentially moving into sort of quite a politically volatile period. And that's when, again, that precariousness of the government majority sort of rears its ugly head once more. What I would say is that what this is pointing to is me saying that the approach for campaigning should be that we engage MPs and peers, and this is obviously preferable, but for many organisations, ultimately probably impossible in terms of capacity. That's certainly the case for us as an organisation alone. We simply would not have the resources to be able to lobby both peers and MPs, probably even on a single piece of legislation that we were campaigning on, let alone sort of across the range of policy areas. And this obviously brings in the importance of partnerships and network buildings. So Ghadah has sort of already outlined the great work Hibiscus do in detail of how they build those networks, and the travel movement is part of some of those networks. I thought I'd just consider from the top how we sort of consider the sort of networks that we build or try to build and what we build them for. I've divided them into strategic coalitions, issue-based partnerships, and resilient networks based on lived experience. This isn't necessarily a neat distinction. It's not a clearly defined boundary, and there's obviously elements of each within each other, but I think it's just a helpful way to sort of conceptualize the approach, certainly that we take at least. So we sort of would understand the strategic coalitions as sort of the specific coalitions that are built around specific pieces of legislation or maybe even specific pieces of sort of statutory guidance. And what we're talking about here really is the aggregation of resources. It allows us to campaign with a far greater footprint than we could do alone. It obviously eases our burden significantly if, rather than faced with, we have to lobby 650 MPs on this before we even consider the Lords, we now might be looking at, we might have to lobby 10 MPs because obviously there's a number of organisations sitting around the same coalition. But I think what's important is that there's still opportunities within these big sort of coalitions for sort of organisational specialism or sort of expert knowledge to still sort of come to the fore, and they also sort of provide opportunities for mutual learning. So to give a couple of examples, I think the Democracy Defence Coalition, which has been led predominantly by Every Vote and Make Votes Matter and Fair Vote UK, has sort of aligned around the elections bill. Again, we're not getting the wins that we necessarily want in the Commons, but there is a I think a necessity to sort of approach the size of the government's majority with the sort of the acceptance that a win might not be defeating the legislation or even getting an amendment. A win might be developing these strategic coalitions, deepening the level of collaboration between organisations in the sector, and hopefully making us more resilient and tougher as a result. So the Democracy Defence Coalition has done some fantastic work bringing together organisations that probably previously never would have collaborated. So right across sort of the civil society sector, charities that ordinarily might not do much political campaigning but are now involved because there are sort of elements that will affect charities in terms of funding, in terms of the sort of the freedom they have to express points of view. And this is, as I say, a really broad coalition, and has allowed us as a charity to sort of outline the specific impacts that this legislation will have on Gypsy, Roma, traveller communities in a way that we probably wouldn't have been able to do alone, because now, instead of it being the traveller movement as stated its position, it's now the Democracy Defence Coalition and a whole range of much bigger bodies and crucially bodies that work in different areas, sort of adding their voices to ours. I would also add to that sort of the Kill the Bill coalition, which has sprung up as initially sort of a grassroots coalition, and that's been really important. Again, I would probably argue that we wouldn't have the sort of national conversation that we've been having around GRT rights, around the right to nomadism, around the right to not be overcriminalised, if it hadn't have been for the really important links that various groups have established, particularly between GRT groups and Black advocacy groups in the UK. I would also mention, opposition to the Nationality and Borders Bill. This has been something that the traveller movement, I would say, has been involved in a quite passive sense. We've supported opposition to the bill. We do advocate, obviously, for a number of migrants or people who do have a claim to other citizenship who would be affected by this bill. But this has been, I think, an example of where we sort of had to accept our own limitations in terms of expertise and in terms of capacity, and take a back seat and let other organisations sort of drive the work on that. And I think that's really important, especially for smaller charities, to sort of accept that you can't do everything, and sometimes you need to let others sort of take the driving seat. And I would say, the work that Hibiscus have done on this, No Borders Manchester, Media Diversified, the Muslim Association of Britain, the Sikh Council really sort of established the framework with which opposition to the bill is now really galvanising around, and these guys have done absolutely fantastic work. I would then say we have what we might call our sort of issue-based partnerships. Again, there is sort of an overlap. There is a blurred line between the two, and it might not be in reality a neater a distinction as I'm making now. But this is sort of the partnerships that we consider that are in response to perhaps policy at a more technical level. It might be sort of engaging with civil servants or with other public bodies or other delivery organisations, as opposed to politicians and sort of changing legislation. The policy might often be at a more technical level, as opposed to sort of a particularly hotly contested area. And we see this as a really important way for us to sort of mainstream the issues that we're talking about. I think there's a real pitfall with any sort of organisation that is advocating for minority or marginalised groups, that things can become pigeonholed quite quickly, and you end up with sort of other organisations or politicians or supporters who are very, very supportive and very, very willing to engage, but every sort of issue is then sort of communicated through the lens of what does this mean for GRT people, in our instance. That's obviously really important to retain that frame. But what we've found is that the sort of building issue-based partnerships with people that might not be considered traditional sort of allies or traditional supporters helps us mainstream the issues in terms of saying where we can make recommendations that are beneficial obviously for the GRT communities for which we advocate, but also in a much wider sense for broader society. So I think particularly we would point to work that we do on not in education, employment and training outcomes for young GRT people. What we found is that the recommendations that we have for the work that we've done there in terms of reform to qualifications, in terms of access to more vocational training, in terms of digital literacy skills, in terms of mentorship schemes, support for self-employment. When we articulate those demands, those recommendations through the prism of they will have the XYZ outcome specifically for GRT communities. Of course, we get the engagement. Of course, we get buy-in from stakeholders, but it is limited. Where we can communicate those recommendations in the context of the benefit that they would have to, in this instance, all young people, we find there is obviously greater engagement with stakeholders who might not otherwise consider themselves interested in GRT issues, and building partnerships with organisations who can help us mainstream those issues is a really powerful way to sort of accelerate that process. Some examples of this from our work that I would use would be we don't always have the greatest relationship with the police, as I'm sure many of you will appreciate and probably empathise with, but we were quite keen to highlight the police's submissions to the various consultations on the bill to really highlight that these aren't particularly powers that they say that they want. Again, it's not a natural coalition that we would build. It might seem counterintuitive, but it's a way to sort of bolster our arguments, particularly with potentially hostile listeners who would then take us seriously in a way that they might not have done before. On meeting outcomes for GRT, I've already mentioned. Racism and bullying in schools. Again, we've sort of started to build relationships which we perhaps would be unexpected with organisations like the National Association of Head Teachers, with the National Education Union, who were very supportive of our recommendation that monitoring and recording of racist incidents in schools should be recorded uniformly across England, which isn't staggeringly currently the case. In many instances, we would come into conflict with these unions because we're having to challenge what we would consider to be unacceptable behaviours and cultures in the school and the classroom. But on this occasion, we've worked with them because even though there are many issues on which we may not be aligned, on this particular issue, there is benefit to both of us. A completely different benefit for schools. The benefit is greater sort of recording regimes can lead to increased funding. It's legal coverage for head teachers who the legislation is currently not particularly clear on who has sort of the ultimate public sector equality duty around racism in schools. So again, sort of improving those processes give teachers and head teachers that little bit more security. For us, obviously, the end point is completely different. We're not uninterested in sort of better protections and better working conditions for teachers. Our primary interest is obviously better outcomes for GRT people. But I think it is important to note that there are, as I say, a multitude of issues on which you can sort of work towards an instrumental partnership, on which you might sort of not agree on the means to get somewhere, but you agree perhaps on the ends, and that's again something that we found valuable. And just as a last example, ethnic monitoring frameworks with regards to sort of public bodies adequately and reliably recording ethnicity data or sort of any data relating to personal and protected characteristics. This is something, again, where our work has been enhanced by building relationships with, for example, the probation service, with the Youth Justice Board, with the Ministry of Justice, where we might not have the exact same intentions or the exact same motivations in mind, but we can at least agree on the ends being sort of mutually beneficial. And there is obviously significant value to that. Lastly, and I would say perhaps most importantly of all in the context of the hostile environment that we're operating in, is sort of resilient networks of what I've called of lived experience. You might call sort of peer networks, you might call grassroots or community networks. And I think this is hugely important in the context of where we are. We've already talked to the Nationality and Borders Bill. We've discussed the Police and Crime Bill. I briefly mentioned the Elections Bill. I think to that you could probably add the minimum age of marriage bill, which started as a private members bill. As a charity, for example, we supported or we support the principle of raising the age of marriage to 18. What we don't support is criminalisation of underage marriage, simply because there is very, very little evidence that it will actually address the root causes of underage marriage. But there is evidence that it will simply drive the problem deeper underground, making it harder to assess the scale of the problem, making it harder to effectively target support and safeguarding measures for those who are affected. So if you take all of those bills together, which variously seek to criminalise different elements of civic life, I think to that you can combine the government's general sort of disregard for standards and for sort of unwritten conventions. And to that, I think most crucially of all, you can add the response to the CERD report last year, in which the government explicitly alleged that there was no such thing as institutional racism in the UK. And this has been a sort of general theme of belittling the experiences that people have had of discrimination in the UK, and quite often trying to pit communities against one another. I think this is something that we particularly saw in the Education Select Committee's report and the subsequent government response last year, entitled, if I remember correctly, the forgotten. It was something like that. It was the white working class, and they were sort of identified as a forgotten demographic. And it's a very clear means of trying to divide and conquer, of trying to set different marginalised groups at each other's throats. We've previously seen it in the UK, particularly with regards to the immigration debate, and it's sort of been a fixture of British politics for quite some time. So building these resilient networks between groups, I think, is really, really important to sort of target and nullify that sort of approach from the government and others. And we really are stronger together than we are obviously apart. I think they're, again, really important opportunities for mutual learning and critically mutual support as well. And they emphasize, I think, the similarities of lived experience. I think this is something, this is a learning experience that we've particularly been on in the past 2 years, of sort of really drilling down to the similar outcomes and the similar lived experience in education and the criminal justice system, particularly between gypsies and travellers and Black Caribbean young people, in terms of exclusions, in terms of off-rolling, in terms of predicting engagement with the criminal justice system. There are so many similarities, and it seems ridiculous not to obviously campaign on those jointly. What it also does, I think, that's important, is it can emphasize the differences between communities, and I think in particular the difference in the way that communities are treated by the state and by the government. And to give a couple of examples of that in a bit more detail, to go back to the racism and bullying sort of requirements in schools, as I previously mentioned, there is currently a requirement for all schools in England to monitor, record, and report instances of bullying or discrimination that are gender or sexuality based, but that isn't the case for race or ethnicity. So again, building those links between us and other organisations advocating for gender or for sexuality allow us to sort of uncover those differences, that sort of unequal treatment that some groups are receiving at the hands of the government, excuse me. As a similar example, we have things like the non-statutory guidance that the Department for Education provides to schools in its preventing and tackling bullying guidance. So in that, there are sort of signposting towards, for example, Tell Mama, the Anne Frank Trust, and other organisations that were sort of specific resources for schools to use that pertain to bullying that's based on race or ethnicity. So again, that difference there, that we don't have that for GRT communities, is an important difference to highlight, and probably one that we would be unaware of if we didn't have links with these sorts of organisations. So again, to give some examples of that, I think religious, for an organisation like us, religious and race-based orgs are really important. We work very, very closely with the Catholic Association for Racial Justice, with the Irish Chaplaincy, with race, the Black Training Education, Black Training Enterprise Group, BTEG, who have recently renamed, and their rebrand still just slips off the top of my head at the moment. Organisations like
Action for Race Equality.
Action for Race Equality, thank you so much. Action for Race Equality, of course. So having those links, I think, is hugely important, both in terms of influencing policy, in terms of opposing some of the harshest edges of discriminatory action from the state, but also in terms of, as I say, building real resilience. It's about, I think the important thing is it's about, particularly with peer networks like this, building the sort of networks that last after the sort of initial moment of maximum pressure has gone. So if the police bill passes, if the nationality and border bill passes, I think what's important to us is that the networks that we're building now are still there afterwards, that we can still collaborate, that we can still work together, because it's really important that these become, I think, in a post-legislative sense, still places in which we can organise that can act almost as a centre of gravity. Sort of looking to the future, I'm sure that many organisations will be looking at how they can monitor the way that the state is using its new powers, potentially identifying routes for strategic litigation to bring against the government in judicial reviews and other sort of legal processes. Things like toolkits and guidance for actual communities. These are all processes that are far easier to undertake jointly rather than as single organisations. And then lastly, I just wanted, as I say, to move on to some brief recollections or some brief reflections on our experience with what we could probably call the Jimmy Carr affair at this point. So for those of you who are unaware, I'll give you just a very quick rundown. On Friday the 4th of February, one of our community members got in touch with us to let us know about a segment that she'd seen in the Jimmy Carr special on Netflix, in which he makes a joke about Roma victims of the genocide and describes it as a positive. This wasn't part of sort of any pre-planned media campaign or any sort of public campaign, and that's why I think it's quite an instructive example, because I think for all of the strategizing and planning that you can do, sometimes things just, especially at a small charity, just take off without you planning for it. And this was certainly one of those cases. We did a tweet about it, sort of indicating our intention to open a dialogue with Netflix. And from there, it sort of went viral pretty quickly. And then from there, sort of the various sort of media outlets jumped on it. At this point on sort of Friday afternoon, we were still expecting this to be sort of 24-hour media cycle. And then on Saturday, Nadine Dorries waded into the row with a full-throated support of Gypsy Roma traveller communities, which we were all absolutely gobsmacked by, to be totally honest. We then had Sajid Javid jumping in. We then had the Prime Minister's spokesman jumping in. And from a cynical position, this was at the time of sort of Partygate, and it seemed pretty clear that they were trying to keep this in the news cycle, at least as far as I'm concerned, to distract from very damaging stories to the government. So just a couple of observations. I think it's important to consider, you know, when you do get caught up in this sort of thing of asking yourself, what is this media engagement for? I think especially for a smaller charity like us, it's easy to sort of get into a reactive mindset and in the weeds a little bit of just thinking, well, we don't normally get this much media attention, so this is great, it's all good. But we thought it was important to sort of go back to first principles. Why are we doing this? Are we trying to apply political pressure? What for? Are we raising awareness? Are we advancing an argument? In this instance, it was obviously a little bit of everything. I think initially our response was sort of explicitly geared towards raising awareness of why the joke was so unacceptable and tying that to sort of the broader discrimination that is endured by Roma people and Gypsies and travellers both in the UK and across Europe. As the government waded into the row, we saw an opportunity to then bring that back to more of a political argument and to sort of specifically highlight the hypocrisy of the government in supporting GRT communities with rhetoric, but seeking to criminalise them with legislation. And then just a couple more observations. It's very easy, I think, again, in a small charity to not say no to the media because there's, you know, no such thing as bad publicity. We're quite careful about picking and choosing our battles. This is perhaps more the case, I think, for GRT charities, perhaps than any other group, simply because of the extent of overwhelming press coverage of GRT groups. And quite frequently, we will say no if we think that an article it's not been approached with the appropriate sensitivity or nuance, or is simply a hatchet job. We sort of take the view that we'd rather not engage rather than have our sort of 3-line quote in an otherwise, you know, very damaging and negative article. I think similarly, we said no to some media requests early on in this process simply because we understood that they were framing this as kind of a cancel culture, woke brigade, you know, lefties, soft snowflakes sort of framing. And we chose not to engage with that, and I think that was the correct decision, because if that narrative would have taken hold, it probably would have become the dominant narrative. So we instead sort of kept our powder dry until we were having discussions with journalists about, you know, the wider issues and the wider implications of what this joke making, and tying it into sort of GRT experiences rather than a nebulous debate about freedom of speech. I think it's really useful to always ask journalists questions as well as answering them. I think it's absolutely fine to seek specifics on what are the people you're talking to for this article, how are you framing this, do you have you know, a different perspective that you're planning to introduce into this article, and can I give you a quote specifically in response to that? And similarly, I think everything's up for negotiation. I think it's easy to sort of accept what journalists offer. What we've done in this process, which initially wasn't really planned, but something that we will certainly be looked to doing in the future, is simply playing journalists off on one another. We sort of, I won't give any outlets, but, you know, we were sort of speaking to one outlet, and they said, yeah, we'll definitely sort of publish on this, and then we used that to take to another outlet and said, oh, this other outlet's interested in publishing, would you be interested in publishing? And then using that to drum up, you know, greater sort of interest. And it will be the case often with the media sort of the media ecosystem, that once one paper picks it up, or once there is a sort of critical mass, the other outlets will follow suit. But that's something that you can try and accelerate yourself as well. And similarly, in terms of negotiating articles, I will quite often say to journalists, what is it that you want me to say that can get me a headline or above the fold or a particular frame? And you can often have that conversation and then sort of make your response, I think, sort of with the editor or with the journalist in mind. That's certainly the approach that we've taken, and I think that's led to some very important coverage, and certainly has highlighted the government's hypocrisy, which thankfully was raised again at Home Office questions yesterday, which again is very helpful. And then I just wanted to end on a quote which I find really useful in trying times like this. It's from one of my heroes, Tony Benn. There is no final victory as there is no final defeat. There is just the same battle to be fought over and over again. So toughen up, bloody toughen up. And I think that is instructive in perhaps the Q&A to follow, in that there are no easy wins at the moment. It's, I think, a very difficult climate to be campaigning in. And we simply have to take whatever win that we have as a win that would be unexpected in the current climate. And I think that's always important to remember. I know this has been a bit of a whistle stop across a number of different issues. What I would say, sort of specifically with regards to parliamentary campaigning, we did recently, or I did recently, sort of provide some training to our guys in-house on sort of specifically lobbying MPs and peers, and if anyone's interested in that material, I'll be happy to share sort of after the event. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Greg. Lots of nodding heads as our office. I'm sure we'll definitely get some requests. Really interesting. I definitely have some questions myself. I'm going to hand over to Jess Mullen. She's Director of Influence and Comms here at Clinks, and she's going to facilitate a Q&A session with both Greg and Ghadah. Hand over to you, Jess.
Hello, everyone. Really nice to see you all. You can see
some people who joined us last week, and yeah, it's just really good to see everyone's faces again. As I say at every event, I miss you all, and it's just really lovely to see people at these events online, even if they're not in person yet. I am really excited to be chairing this Q&A. I've got loads of questions, and thanks very much both to Ghadah and Greg, because that was all really fascinating, and particularly wonderful to end on a Tony Benn quote. I think last week we had people talking about frontline staff staging sit-ins in council offices, which I think is definitely valid influencing policy. And now we've got Tony Benn quotes. So I'm very happy with the way things are going. But yeah, I think, you know, this discussion is really interesting in a number of ways. It's obviously really topical with what was in Parliament last night, and really interesting to see how we get wins in some areas, but maybe not so much in others, and how we keep going. But also in the context of, for those of you who were at the event last week, you know, where we were really talking about how we get to a point where sometimes you don't win the absolute war, but you maybe win battles along the way, and how do you celebrate those battles? But I think this is maybe the next stage in the conversation about, well, when you're campaigning on something that actually government policy is quite oppositional to and is going in very much the wrong direction, what do you do? So I suppose my first question really to you both is, you know, where do you see the value in campaigning on things that you think actually we might not win this, and when do you make the call that it's still the right thing to do? And you know, even if we can't stop bad policy, what is the value still on campaigning on it from your points of view? I don't know who wants to jump in.
I can jump in.
Go on, Ghadah.
Just to give Greg maybe a break to get his breath. Yeah. So I think from experience working, let's say on the this tackling double disadvantage, I think as in 5 organizations decided if we wanted to do it to address really big issues, I don't think we will get anywhere. I think when we decided to make it more very specific for really kind of effective for a certain group of people, and then maybe give a solution how these changes can happen, and as well as offering the specialties and kind of experience of the organization on helping policymakers and government officials on working on that. I think that could be a way to do it, in terms instead of just saying, okay, it's like, you know, there are major issues that need to be changed. I think, and this is when we find out that when we did that, we actually got more attention, and we been kind of called in closed meetings to talk about these issues and to work on how to address them, and the support from the organization on certain issues. And I think this is the way to probably to think about it and to do it. And I think it's as well as to celebrate the small wins, even if we cannot change it now, but even just have the opportunity to actually, talk about it, and maybe bring the people with lived experience to the table to kind of they feedback on these issues, which is give evidence, and at the Parliament or at a really government meetings. I think this is this kind of more of you creating this kind of solidarity with the people, and a representation, and why you care for these issues, and that could be a beginning of the kind of end change. So so I think we definitely need to make sure that we celebrate the small wins and keep working on the big challenges.
Yeah, I think Ghadah's absolutely right. I think the note on solidarity for Gypsy Roma traveller communities, and indeed for many others, where you are faced with almost a constant barrage of being told that you'll either implicitly or explicitly never quite be accepted. that sort of support, even in the face of probable defeat, is really important. It's obviously something that community members would particularly expect from us as a charity. You know, we're here to advocate for them. We're here to win for them where we can, but we're here to advocate for them regardless. I think it's also powerful to see that support coming from outside as well, and that's why I talked about this importance of partnership building, because those small but concrete examples of solidarity of other communities standing together can be a powerful antidote to feeling like you are isolated and alone. In terms of sort of the question about when do you stop campaigning, and when do you sort of decide that this isn't worth the time anymore, I think that point is, I was going to say when a bill gets royal assent, but I think not even then. There is certainly, I think there's no sort of definitive concrete here are the criteria by which we decide that we're going to stop engaging. I think we make judgment calls on what we believe is the direction of travel, and then maybe we won't be engaging as heavily. We'll still be putting out, you know, social media assets or various sort of campaigning emails or sort of small briefings, but we might not be doing as much intense work. But I think it's really important to have to keep campaigning on things, simply to retain the framework and the structure. Sort of as I said earlier, I think we live in very, very politically volatile times, and I think there's no sense of what might happen next. I think you can sort of look back to maybe the poll tax riots of the early 90s, and how that was unforeseen right up until it happened, and then when it happened it was seen as inevitable. And I think even with the sort of the political majority that the Tories have now, that might not be there tomorrow. It might not be there. You know, what happens if we get a new Conservative Prime Minister in? What happens if X? What happens if Y? So I think it's important to have those frameworks ready for that eventuality. And then lastly, I would just say, you know, once a bill does get royal assent, I think there's real opportunities where a bill has to be accompanied by statutory guidance, as would be the case for this big sort of pieces of legislation. There is a chance to then engage further in a sort of more depoliticized context, perhaps with civil servants who are more sympathetic than government ministers, and to have that framework, to have that expertise, to not have let the campaign have drifted, makes that engagement further in the process much easier. And then very lastly, very quickly, yeah, I think it's very important to celebrate the small wins, no matter how small they are, because I think it's a means by which we galvanize each other, by which we keep momentum, and probably keep ourselves sane as well, to be fair.
Thanks both. Everything you're saying is sparking more and more questions, and I am conscious of coming out to the audience in a sec, but I think I can maybe squeeze in one or two more. And one of the things I'm thinking about is you've both talked about essentially dealing with very systemic and embedded issues of racism and institutionalized racism, and you've talked about how you can make links with other groups to address those, but I'm interested maybe in how making links between the issues that you're campaigning on and how you found that. So Greg, you made the point about, you know, things in the police crime and sentencing bill having relevance both to, you know, the civil liberties work you do and the criminal justice work you do, and similarly education and criminal justice and the links between exclusion and the pipeline into the criminal justice system. So I'm wondering what experience you have of how that join up is received by those you're seeking to influence, and how you get them to recognise those systemic links between things.
I think I've got an interesting example actually around the work that we've done on NEAT outcomes, and similarly our chair of trustees, Pauline, gave evidence to the Education Select Committee last week regarding their inquiry on GRT education. So within a day of that evidence session, we were contacted by a government department saying that they were very, very interested in the testimony, and could they also have our copies of written evidence that we submitted. Surprisingly, it wasn't the Department for Education that asked for that, it was the Ministry of Justice. And I think this is obviously Clinks having sort of convened this session. I think most of the people here will be operating in criminal justice. What I would say about CGS and the MOJ is that although it might not feel like it, the MOJ are probably one of the better departments to work with, in terms of they have some degree of accountability structures. They have specific individuals within the civil service who are tasked with taken forward LAMI review implementation, and that is a structure that is absent in a lot of other government departments. So what I would say is that surprisingly, there are a multitude of areas where, even though it might not be a criminal justice policy area, we get better engagement from the MOJ than we do the Whitehall department, whose responsibility it actually is. And then I did have something else to say, but it's gone completely out of my head, so I'll hand over to Ghadah.
Let us know if it comes back to you.
Yeah, I mean, as like as Hibiscus, I mean, yes, then like I agree with Greg. I think the MOJ are more like you know, open, and especially, I mean, I think for example, we are part of the female offender ethnic minority working group, and it's a really a group of specialist organization, and they bring like government officials from MOJ to address certain issues and work on and getting some feedback from us and how to improve the work. But it's still quite kind of difficult and not easy kind of system to break or to navigate. But I think the more like you kind of address issues that is kind of more achievable and work with them on that, I think that could be kind of a win. So for example, they offer us that we could do a session on the 10-point action plan, and they gonna provide, like we can bring the people with lived experience and just to feedback on these you know, certain actions that we are calling for. But at the same time, I think we are very, like as an organization, we are very aware of not to kind of traumatize our clients or bring them to the table when they have actually, they needed to be listened to as equal counterpart, not like to be having a petty on or. So this is a quite, you know, difficult for an organization to make sure the safeguarding as well as how to involve people with lived experience and center them into the work. And this is what we do internally. We have guides on how to work with the people with lived experience into including them into the work. So this is exactly like we had another meeting with one of the MPs, Lynn Brown, and we asked for a parliament debate on the action plan. And one of her comments saying, "Oh, don't bring the people with lived experience. They're not going to be seen as you know, like providing evidence. They actually could be a negative way of, you know, promoting what changes you want." So these are totally different kind of experiences they have, that she invite us that to bring you know, kind of them onto a later stage, not at the beginning, because they're not going to be taken really like seriously. So so as an organization and representing the you know, the client, we really need to make sure that where and how and different kind of different external stakeholders, when we are engaging with them, how we can make sure that they are included and valid and not being harmed.
Brilliant, thanks. There's some questions in the chat, so I'm going to come out to the audience. Olivia at Working Chance, do you want to ask your question?
So she said that she's got some construction going on, so can't.
Okay, Olivia, I can ask it. Just 2 secs. I've got to scroll up to make sure I find the right one. Olivia is asking if you have any tips for building relationships with MPs and how to identify key allies and approach them.
Well, for us, it's in terms of identifying key allies. I think for the travel movement, it's quite easy. In the how do I put this diplomatically? Most MPs, most politicians won't speak positively about Gypsy Roma travellers. For the vast majority of politicians, the best that we can hope is that they don't say anything at all. So when there are MPs who are willing to stand up and say, here are the issues to the GRT community, or the way that they're being treated is unacceptable, or XYZ, it's quite easy for us to identify who the key allies are. In terms of building new relationships with MPs, I sort of go back to the point about mainstreaming. We may be able to sort of pull an emotional thread if we go in sort of guns blazing and really sort of articulate, you know, did you know that 91% of GRT people in the UK have experienced discrimination? Do you understand that 3/4 hide their ethnicity because that discrimination is so rife? How would that make you feel? That might get the response that we want. But to sort of go in and mainstream, to identify, I think, the MPs that might not have ever expressed an awareness of the work that you do, or solidarity with the groups that you advocate for, if you can sort of identify, as we've done for some education stuff, that certain MPs are really interested in, say, vocational education, or really interested in, from a criminal justice point of view, meaningful activities in prison. That's kind of the in. I think the policy area is always the in, and then you can advocate for the group second once you've said, we've got a really cool policy here that we think is a really good idea. And then if that gets the interest, then is the time to sort of explain the position of the group that you're advocating for. I think that's the way that we always try and do it.
Ghadah.
Yes, I totally agree with Greg. I think you should maybe just do your homework and just see if any of the MPs actually mentioned, like, or supported the group of the people that you are supporting, and any issues they raise, and you can actually address that. I mean, from an experience, like, for example, with David Lammy, and his report was based on the work that we did. So it was quite easy to kind of more engage with him and other MPs that are like, they were contributed to the review or part of it. And maybe as well, I kind of, from like one of the groups that we organized with the women, some of their feedback on their MPs. So, for example, I think one of them said, like, oh, I wrote to David Lammy, and he's really responded to me, and he's really, like, you know, supported my case. And others mentioned other MPs. So I think if they are engaged with citizens, with the public, and on the issues that your client are facing, this is what you can maybe like build up on some of the relationship and find out if they have interest in your campaign, on the work you do.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm going to try and squeeze in two more. Laura Cook, do you want to say what organisation you're from as well, Laura?
Yeah, hello, hi there. So I'm Laura Cook, and I am ESOL Policy and Programme Manager at the Bell Foundation. So I work with Emily. Yeah, so my question is actually about another piece of work that I'm doing, although it's related to my day job as well. So I'm currently doing a CLAW social leadership course for people working in the refugee and migration sector. So we're at the Peer Innovation Challenge stage, which is thinking about how the sector can work together to solve particular challenges. And the group that I'm working in is looking at how we can empower community level organisations to campaign or influence policy and practice change for themselves. So we're at very sort of early stages of this, but thinking about what would actually help community organisations to do that. I mean, I've kind of got my own policy background and my own knowledge, but working at a national level, but yeah, not so much at that lived experience level, I suppose.
Either if you want to.
I think it's a really tough question. It's sort of like the perennial question for us. I think something that you'll probably sort of be well aware of, Laura, is language issues. That's obviously huge for migrant and refugee communities, but also for many GRT communities. Digital illiteracy, low skills, functional skills in maths and English is a huge barrier. And there is that difficulty of that being such a huge systemic issue that there aren't sort of quick and easy fixes. But I think it's a sense of, I think for us as an organisation, we try and actively listen as much as we can. wherever possible, we do peer-based research, and we also sort of provide our peer researchers with sort of qualitative skills, so they can sort of be able to sort of analyze those issues, and we're not going to then expect that they're going to produce a suite of recommendations that is clearly targeted at specific stakeholders and is expressed in a technical language. But that's our job, is to take the bones of what they believe needs to change, and then we find a way to communicate that. So I think our role is almost as a translator between communities and sort of policy stakeholders.
Ghadah, do you want to add anything?
I think like in terms of like the language issue is as Greg said, it's quite important, but as well as the cultural issues. I think we should definitely make sure that, because I don't know, like for an experience, we had a project officer from Kosovo that was able to support women from Albania, and that was like a safe place for the Albanian women. I think if it was from Albania, that would be creating some. So I think it's the cultural plus the kind of language is very important to know and address. And I think this is what we need to, you need to, upscale that, like from the work that we do to the government as well. It's not only like people with, have it like struggling with their English, but as well as they have cultural needs and they have to be met as well. I think as well, like for an experience, we are trying to train women to be maybe cultural mediators as well. So part of the support, we support them directly with their own language, with the cultural need, but as well as developing their skills to be a cultural mediators, so they can support others which the same cultural needs and language needs. So maybe that could be a possibility for a scheme or a kind of a program that you could think about how you could develop the people with lived experience, offer them job opportunities, internship within your organization, and develop that. And this is one of the kind of good practice that within Hibiscus we are doing, we are having a plan to recruit maybe even trustees with lived experience and kind of more involve them with the decision making and recentering their voices like across the organization work.
Thanks. I'm going to squeeze in one more and I'm going to combine it. So Elizabeth at Latin American Women's Rights Service has asked a question about advice for working in partnership with other organisations, and in particular with larger organisations, and how, I guess, as organisations by and for racially minoritised people, you deal with those power dynamics and the risk of your issues being co-opted. And I'm going to ask to combine that slightly with the question I wanted to end on, which was what you think organisations who aren't necessarily by and for racially minoritised people, but nonetheless want to show allyship, what you think they can do to do that.
I think that's a fantastic question from Elizabeth. I think there's sort of a couple of elements to it. One of which is, I suppose, the funding of the charity sector. We sort of the landscape is that we have to prove what we're doing. I think that makes it. That's generally speaking. I think from our perspective, we're not gutted if we can prove that we've done the work on a campaign internally and we can demonstrate that to our funders. If we're not sort of the front and center of that campaign or that collaboration or that whatever it is, it's kind of more important to us that the progress is had rather than whose specific name is attached to it. That said, I think obviously there is the risk of larger organisations either co-opting or using the work of small organisations to cover their own lack of action. I don't think there's sort of unfortunately, my perspective would be, you have to wait and see if it happens, and then if it happens, not to work with that organisation again. In terms of sort of organisations who might not have a specific mission or vision towards racial or social justice in any sort of way, I think again sort of goes back to what I sort of, not the cleanest delineation, but sort of the idea of having real resilient ongoing networks, and then perhaps sort of issue-based partnerships, where you can sort of get that buy-in of, oh, okay, this isn't your MO, you're not an organisation formed towards, you know, racial equality, but you know, you're doing this work on this one thing and we can agree on that even if we don't agree on the reason that we agree on it, and sometimes that can be enough if it's just for progressing that one particular area. And I would say, you know, sort of don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Obviously there will be certain organizations that you would never work with because the differences are too great to overcome, but if you spot an opportunity for there is even some crossover, it's worth considering, if not taking, I would say.
Have you got in 30 seconds anything to add, because I'm conscious of people's time? But it's a really important issue.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, like, maybe map your expertise, skills, and kind of support and services that each organization going to bring to the overall aim of the campaign, and identify the role, and then kind of more of a common ground on, are you still aiming to the same kind of achieving the same goal? And recheck that during your campaign and reinforce that, and make sure that you're not drifted away from where you started, because that's, from an experience, it could be really hard to please everyone. Everyone wants, like, the campaign to be more targeted to their organizations, kind of more of aim, and some of it will be like one of the organization will end it up before, like, the campaign will be launched, that they don't actually have anything to put input on that. So just to make sure that you do this work, and it's quite a hard process to work with partnerships and make, but I think it would be really good to have these kind of steering groups meetings and reassuring that you are still working on the same aim. I definitely agree with Greg, like, if there's an organization, you can either join their statement, like reshare their campaign, join them, and that will be make a massive kind of impact than just not doing anything about it.
Thank you, and sorry, I know I've let us run over a little bit, but I could talk about this for hours, I think. So thank you so much to both of you, and thank you to everyone's questions. I'm just going to hand back to Nuri to just finish up.
Thank you so much, and thank you for those of you that have stuck ahead after we've almost after time. Really interesting discussion. Again, really found it useful and got lots of food for thought at the moment, which is why I'm waffling. As I said at the beginning of the call, this is part of a wider program of training delivered under the Stronger Voice project. There's a few more events that are advertised on our events page over the next couple of weeks, and the second phase that I mentioned will be launching a little bit soon. I'm just going to pop the events page in the chat in case you don't have access to it, and we do have one in 2 weeks time, same sort of time, focusing on advocating for women in the criminal justice system, so that will also be another really interesting session. So I'd love to see a few more of you there. We're going to send around a post-event email with some of the resources that were mentioned today. Greg's very helpful, put his email in the chat, but I'll get him to, we'll put it in that email as well as any other thing that was shared today. And also there'll be an evaluation form. We usually try to do a poll at the end of sessions, but I'm conscious not to keep you any longer than I have to. So just look out for that evaluation form in the email. That would be great. And then finally, just want to say thank you again for coming. I know that we're really busy. I know that everyone's still got a Zoom fatigue after the last 2 years. So thank you so much for joining us. We've really enjoyed the discussion, and we hope to see you at another event soon.
Thank you.